an addicted drifter named Townes Van Zandt, sleeping on the floors of cheap motels and rejected by the commercial music industry. Yet this same ragged man was a living legend, deeply respected by America's greatest music icons. Why did a genius born into extreme wealth throw away his fortune to choose a life of ruin? Rejecting Nashville's golden cage to protect the purity of his music, he spiraled into alcohol and drugs until his body completely collapsed at the age of 52. In the end, what is the exact price of keeping a completely free and original soul? John Townes Van Zandt, born on March 7, 1944, in Fort Worth, Texas, Van Zandt was the scion of a prominent, deeply entrenched Texas dynasty. The Van Zandt name carried heavy historical and financial weight. His great-grandfather, Isaac Van Zandt, was a pivotal figure in the Republic of Texas, serving as a diplomat and participating directly in the annexation of Texas to the United States. A county in East Texas bears the family name. This historical prestige was backed by vast generational wealth derived from the Texas oil boom and extensive cattle ranching operations. His father, Harris Williams Van Zandt, was a highly successful corporate lawyer who managed oil interests, ensuring the family lived in upper-class affluence. Townes was raised in an environment characterized by country clubs, private education, and rigid societal expectations. The trajectory of his life was mapped out from birth. With an intelligence quotient tested at genius level, the family apparatus was designed to funnel him toward an elite university, a law degree, and a career in either corporate litigation or state politics. He was sent to the Shattuck School, a strict, prestigious military academy in Faribault, Minnesota. The objective was to instill discipline and prepare him for the leadership roles expected of a Van Zandt. He performed well academically and engaged in wrestling, fulfilling the outward metrics of a successful, affluent young man. However, beneath the surface of this engineered success, significant psychological fractures were developing. The extreme expectations of his lineage, combined with a highly sensitive and volatile nervous system, began to manifest as severe clinical depression. When he enrolled at the University of Colorado at Boulder in 1965, the rigid structure of his military schooling vanished, and the underlying mental illness took over. At Boulder, his behavior became erratic and destructive. He did not engage in the typical collegiate partying of the era. Instead, his substance use was an immediate, aggressive attempt at self-medication. He consumed massive quantities of alcohol, utilizing liquor to numb severe depressive episodes and uncontrollable mood swings. His academic performance disintegrated. He would isolate himself for days, incapable of attending classes or functioning within the university framework. Recognizing a severe crisis, his parents pulled him out of the University of Colorado and brought him back to Texas, enrolling him at the University of Houston in an attempt to monitor his condition. The intervention failed. His psychological state deteriorated further, marked by periods of extreme mania, followed by paralyzing depression. In the mid-1960s, psychiatric diagnostics were blunt instruments. Doctors evaluated the wealthy, highly intelligent college student who was drinking himself into stupors and exhibiting wildly fluctuating emotional states. They diagnosed him with manic depression, the condition now classified as bipolar disorder. Because the Van Zandt family possessed significant financial resources, they sought out the most aggressive and advanced psychiatric treatments available at the time. In the 1960s, Psychopharmacology was still in its infancy. For severe, intractable cases of manic depression, the psychiatric establishment often turned to somatic therapies. The doctors recommended a brutal, invasive procedure, insulin shock therapy. Developed in the 1930s by Austrian-American psychiatrist Manfred Sackel, insulin coma therapy was based on the flawed premise that inducing a physiological crisis could reset a severely mentally ill brain. The procedure was physically devastating. Medical staff injected Townes with massive, deliberate overdoses of insulin. The immediate effect was a catastrophic drop in blood sugar, plunging his brain into severe hypoglycemia. Deprived of glucose, the brain began to malfunction violently. Townes was forced into deep comas, lasting for an hour or more, while experiencing severe, uncontrollable grand mal seizures. The physical trauma of the convulsions was so extreme that patients routinely suffered fractured bones and dislocated joints during the seizures. Medical staff then brought him out of the coma by administering intravenous glucose. This violent cycle of chemically induced coma and seizure was repeated dozens of times over a period of weeks. The psychiatric establishment eventually abandoned insulin shock therapy entirely, recognizing it as ineffective and highly dangerous, carrying a significant risk of permanent brain damage and death. For Townes Van Zandt, the medical aftermath was permanent and catastrophic. The repeated severe hypoglycemia damaged the hippocampus and other regions of the brain responsible for memory consolidation. The therapy failed to cure his bipolar disorder or alleviate his depression, but it successfully triggered severe retrograde amnesia. When Townes emerged from the psychiatric hospital, a massive portion of his long-term memory had been permanently erased. The procedure wiped out almost all recollections of his childhood, his adolescence, and his early college years. The foundational memories that anchor a human identity were gone. He was a young man in his early 20s, possessing a genius-level intellect and a trust fund, but carrying a mind filled with static and blank spaces. This medical trauma fundamentally altered his trajectory. The rigid, pre-planned life of a corporate lawyer was no longer a viable or desirable option for a man who could not remember his own past. He attempted to resume classes at the University of Houston, but the effort was hollow. He was going through the motions of a life he no longer connected with. The final tether to his inherited life snapped in 1966. His father, Townes Van Zandt, suffered a fatal heart attack. The death of the family patriarch removed the primary enforcer of the Van Zandt legacy. There was no longer anyone to demand that Townes finish his pre-law degree or conform to the expectations of the Texas elite. In the immediate aftermath of his father's death, Townes made a clinical absolute decision. He formally withdrew from the University of Houston. He turned his back on the family estate, the country clubs, and the generational wealth. Armed with an acoustic guitar and a fractured brain, he walked away from the affluent suburbs. He stepped directly into the underground folk clubs and transient street life of Houston. The wealthy scion was dead. The deliberate outcast was born. The medical erasure of John Townes Van Zandt's memory created an absolute psychological vacuum. Nature and the human mind abhor a void, and in the absence of a past, Van Zandt constructed a present built entirely on relentless, unforgiving observation. He replaced the missing decades of his personal history with a hyperfixation on the mechanics of songwriting. This was not a hobby or a career path chosen from a list of options. It was a psychological compulsion necessary to anchor a mind that had been forcibly untethered from its own timeline. Between 1968 and 1973, this compulsion resulted in a period of staggering, almost maniacal creative output. Over this 5-year span, he wrote and recorded the material for 6 full-length albums. For the sake of the song, Our Mother the Mountain, Townes Van Zandt, Delta Mama Blues, High, Low, and In Between, and the late great Townes Van Zandt. In the context of the music industry, producing 6 albums of original, highly complex material in such a compressed time frame is a logistical and mental anomaly. It indicates a mind operating at a dangerous, unsustainable velocity. This half-decade served as the crucible wherein the darkest, most enduring masterpieces of American roots music were forged. Van Zandt's music functioned as a series of clinical, psychological autopsies. While mainstream country music in the late 1960s and early 1970s was preoccupied with highly polished, narrative-driven songs about infidelity, trucking, or idealized rural life, Van Zandt's focus was entirely subterranean. He wrote with forensic precision about the inescapable realities of the human condition, physical decay, terminal isolation, and the ever-present specter of death. There were no aspirational lyrics about acquiring wealth, large houses, or new cars. He stripped away the veneer of the American dream to examine the rot underneath. The song "Waitin' Around to Die" stands as the definitive prime example of this methodology. He did not write it in a professional studio or a comfortable writing room. According to verified accounts from his first wife, he locked himself inside a small dark closet in their apartment to isolate himself from every external stimulus. In that cramped, suffocated space, he engineered a ballad about a drifter whose life is a sequential cascade of misery, moving from domestic abuse to transient labor, robbery, and ultimately a terminal addiction to codeine. The song does not offer redemption. It does not offer a moral lesson. It is a stark, factual reporting of a life actively self-destructing, concluding that the addiction is simply a mechanism to pass the time until the biological clock runs out. This was the exact antithesis of commercial entertainment. Pancho and Lefty, widely considered his magnum opus, utilizes the framework of a Western ballad not to romanticize outlaws, but to dissect the mechanics of betrayal and the brutal, unglamorous reality of aging. The song contrasts the violent, celebrated death of one bandit with the slow, freezing, anonymous decay of the man who sold him out for survival. Similarly, tracks like If I Needed You, reportedly written in his sleep while suffering from a severe flu, demonstrate a subconscious mind that was constantly, obsessively generating complex chord structures and profound lyrical poetry, even when the physical body was failing. Producing this level of unvarnished truth required a deliberate rejection of comfort. Van Zandt recognized early on that material wealth and domestic stability were direct threats to his creative process. They acted as insulation, protecting a person from the raw, abrasive realities he needed to observe and document. To maintain a state of absolute, uninterrupted focus on his craft, he engineered a lifestyle of extreme, calculated deprivation. He chose to live essentially as a ghost, haunting the fringes of society. During the 1970s, this commitment to austerity led him to inhabit environments that most would consider uninhabitable. For extended periods, he took up residence in a dilapidated one-room shack situated on a tract of land outside of Franklin, Tennessee, and later in similar structures in Colorado and Texas. These were not rustic retreats, they were crude shelters made of mismatched tin and rotting wood. There was no running water, there was no electricity, there was no central heating to combat the severe winter temperature drops. Survival in these conditions required intense daily physical labor. He had to chop his own wood for a cast iron stove to avoid freezing. He had to haul water by hand in buckets from nearby creeks or wells just to drink or boil beans. He existed entirely off the grid, subsisting on canned goods, whatever cheap provisions he could acquire, and occasionally shooting local wildlife. This was a man whose trust fund could have easily purchased a comfortable estate in any city in America. Yet he actively selected extreme poverty. The shack functioned as a sensory deprivation chamber. By stripping away every modern convenience, every distraction, and every comfort, he forced his mind into a corner where the only remaining action was to write. The physical suffering was not accidental. It was the price of admission he charged himself to access the depths of his own psyche. When he was not isolated in a tin shack, he was in constant, erratic motion across the United States. He refused to participate in the standard organized touring circuits managed by booking agencies. Instead, he relied on the unpredictable and often dangerous method of hitchhiking, standing on the shoulders of interstate highways in the late 1960s and 1970s, a lone, gaunt figure with a guitar case. He placed his physical safety entirely in the hands of random motorists. His touring logistics were virtually non-existent. He did not have a road manager, a backing band, or a merchandise table. He traveled with a beaten acoustic guitar and frequently nothing more than a canvas sack filled with copies of his own vinyl records. He moved from town to town, negotiating his own stage time at some of the most run-down, obscure dive bars and listening rooms in the country. These were venues where the patrons were often highly intoxicated, completely disinterested in folk music, and prone to violence. He would stand under the dim, nicotine-stained lights of these roadhouses and deliver his intricate, devastating poetry to audiences of 5 or 10 people who were more focused on their cheap draft beer than the genius unfolding on stage. He would play a set, sell a few records out of his sack for enough cash to buy a bottle of liquor and a bus ticket to the next town, or simply stick his thumb back out on the highway. There was absolutely no glamour, no security, and no safety net. He was a wealthy heir actively living the life of a destitute vagrant, treating the grueling, dirty reality of the road as the necessary fieldwork for his songwriting. He was gathering the raw data of human suffering firsthand, ensuring that the despair in his music was never theoretical, but violently, undeniably real. The undeniable gravity of Townes Van Zandt's songwriting did not remain a secret in the Texas dive bars for long. By the late 1960s, the raw data of his genius had filtered back to the executives controlling the American country music industry. The epicenter of this industry was Nashville, Tennessee, specifically the tight geographic and corporate cluster known as Music Row. When the A&R men and record producers heard the intricate finger-picking and the devastating lyrical structures of his early compositions, they did not hear the desperate psychological survival mechanisms of a traumatized heir. They heard raw material. They smelled a highly marketable, potentially lucrative commodity, provided it could be properly processed. The collision that followed becomes completely inevitable when analyzing the exact mechanics of the Nashville music machine during this era. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the country music establishment was fighting a desperate market share war against rock and roll. To retain their audience and expand into the lucrative pop crossover market, Nashville producers like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley had engineered a highly specific standardized audio product known as the Nashville Sound, or Countrypolitan. This was not an artistic movement. It was a factory assembly line. The business model was ruthlessly efficient. Labels would take rough, authentic country singers and systematically scrub away the grit. The acoustic guitars and fiddles were pushed to the background or eliminated entirely. In their place, producers layered tracks with lush, sweeping string sections recorded by the Nashville Symphony. They added smooth, intrusive backing vocal choirs. They utilized session musicians who played the exact same flawless, sanitized licks on dozens of records a week. The goal was to manufacture a product that was completely non-threatening, emotionally digestible, and perfectly calibrated for mass consumption on AM radio. When independent producer Kevin Eggers and his newly formed Poppy Records label signed Van Zandt in 1968, they immediately subjected his music to this exact commercial meat grinder. Eggers partnered with legendary Nashville producer Jack Clement. Clement was a brilliant architect of sound, having worked closely with Johnny Cash and Jerry Lee Lewis at Sun Records. However, when applied to Van Zandt's deeply introverted, skeletal folk blues, the standard Nashville production formula resulted in an auditory catastrophe. The production of Van Zandt's debut album, For the Sake of the Song, released in 1968, serves as the definitive forensic evidence of this industrial mismatch. The record executives took Van Zandt's stark, terrifying examinations of human frailty and aggressively smothered them in inappropriate commercial instrumentation. They layered his solitary acoustic guitar with swelling, intrusive harpsichords. They inexplicably added flutes to songs dealing with chronic depression. Most jarringly, they overlaid several tracks with bright, blaring mariachi brass sections. The executives believed they were fixing the music. They assumed Van Zandt's unadorned voice and single guitar were merely demos, incomplete sketches that required the heavy, expensive gloss of the Nashville machine to become real products suitable for retail sale. They calculated that adding strings and horns would make the darkness palatable to Middle American radio listeners. Van Zandt's reaction to this commercial packaging was absolute visceral disgust. He viewed the production of his debut album not as a professional milestone, but as a desecration. The addition of synthetic, cheerful instrumentation over lyrics detailing suicide, addiction, and terminal loneliness was a fundamental violation of the truth he was attempting to document. He despised the manufactured product so thoroughly that in the following years, he would systematically re-record almost every single track from For the Sake of the Song on subsequent albums, stripping away the horns and strings to return the compositions to their original skeletal states. This initial clash set the operational standard for the rest of his career. Van Zandt immediately recognized that the Nashville machine required total submission. The industry demanded that artists function as compliant cogs within a corporate structure. They were expected to adhere to strict recording schedules. They were required to perform at industry showcases, smiling and glad-handing with radio programmers and distribution executives. Most importantly, they were expected to alter their art upon demand to satisfy demographic research and broadcast standards. Van Zandt categorically refused to participate in any phase of this machinery. His refusal was not passive. It was an active, deliberate campaign of professional sabotage. He treated the corporate apparatus with overt contempt. When executives or public relations managers scheduled standard promotional tours, grueling itineraries designed to force artists to court regional radio DJs in exchange for airplay, Van Zandt simply would not comply. If he was forced into a radio station lobby, he refused to play the role of the grateful, aspiring star. He would give monosyllabic answers during the interviews, openly mock the artificiality of the broadcast, or simply show up highly intoxicated and incapable of functioning. He viewed the mandatory socializing with the Nashville elite, the cocktail parties, the publisher meetings, the strategic alliances, as a toxic environment that would contaminate his focus. The most intense battles occurred over the lyrics themselves. The A and R departments and radio promoters were terrified of his subject matter. Country radio in the late 1960s was highly conservative, heavily monitored by the FCC, and dependent on advertising dollars from family-oriented brands. The industry demanded clear moral narratives. When producers looked at a composition like Waitin' Around to Die, they saw a massive liability. A song that explicitly details a protagonist abandoning his battered mother, committing armed robbery, doing prison time, and ultimately finding his only solace in a terminal addiction to codeine was strictly forbidden on the American airwaves. Executives explicitly requested that he change the lyrics. They asked for a glimmer of hope at the end of the song, a moral lesson, or at the absolute minimum, the removal of the specific narcotics references. Van Zandt's response was a flat, non-negotiable rejection. He would not alter a single syllable to appease a broad-key, as standard, or a marketing department. He understood that changing the lyrics to make the song sellable would instantly render it a lie. To him, an ugly truth was infinitely more valuable than a profitable fiction. This extreme, unyielding stance triggered immediate, severe consequences. In the highly centralized music industry of the 1970s, you could not circumvent the Nashville gatekeepers. By refusing to play the game, Van Zandt actively initiated his own blacklisting. Radio stations across the country received his records, noted the dark subject matter and the lack of commercial polish, and threw them directly into the trash. Without radio airplay, there was no mass market exposure. Without mass exposure, his records languished in warehouses. Poppy Records eventually folded, largely due to financial mismanagement, but also because their flagship artist was actively resisting his own monetization. Furthermore, his sabotage extended to alienating the very individuals within the system who genuinely recognized his genius and attempted to shelter him. Jack Clement, despite the production missteps of the first album, deeply respected Van Zandt's raw talent. Kevin Egger spent years attempting to secure funding and distribution for Van Zandt's work, often putting his own financial stability on the line. Yet Van Zandt routinely humiliated and frustrated these allies. He would vanish for weeks before crucial recording sessions. He would arrive at the studio heavily under the influence of heroin or alcohol, making it physically impossible to track a usable vocal take. He forced the people trying to build his career to deal with a constant, chaotic barrage of broken contracts, missed deadlines, and erratic behavior. This was not merely the unreliability of an addict. It was a deeply ingrained hostile defense mechanism. by making himself impossible to manage, impossible to produce, and impossible to market. He ensured that the Nashville machine could never consume him. He successfully protected the integrity of his songwriting, but the collateral damage of this tactical strike was the complete intentional destruction of his own commercial viability. He chose the absolute margins, guaranteeing a life of financial ruin, because the alternative, becoming a package commodity on a corporate assembly line, was a compromise his rigid, fractured psychology simply could not tolerate. By isolating himself from the commercial machinery, Townes Van Zandt inadvertently claimed the absolute center of a movement he had no intention of joining. In the 1970s, the music press and record industry began heavily marketing a new subgenre dubbed outlaw country. The corporate narrative focused on artists like Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, and Tom Paul Glaser, positioning them as dangerous rebels fighting the establishment. However, a forensic examination of the outlaw movement reveals a distinct difference in operational objectives. Jennings and Nelson were highly successful, ambitious professionals. Their rebellion was essentially a labor dispute. They fought RCA Records and other major labels for specific contractual rights, the right to use their own road bands in the studio instead of union session players, the right to select their own material, and the right to design their own album covers. They wanted creative control, but they still actively pursued massive commercial success, radio dominance, and stadium tours. They operated within the system, leveraging their star power to rewrite their contracts. Van Zandt did not want to rewrite the contract. He refused to sign it. He did not care about stadium tours or Billboard chart positions. While the marketed outlaws were wearing leather vests and growing their hair out to cultivate a specific rebellious brand image for retail consumption, Van Zandt was functionally homeless, living in unheated shacks and actively destroying his own distribution deals. He was not adopting a persona. The industry, I recognize this fundamental difference. Among his peers, the actual architects of American songwriting, Van Zandt was not viewed as a colleague. He was viewed as an immovable standard of absolute, uncompromising authenticity. The reverence directed toward him by established musical heavyweights was explicit and heavily documented. Bob Dylan, widely considered the architect of modern lyrical songwriting, actively sought Van Zandt out. During a tour stop in Austin, Texas, Dylan arranged a private meeting, an extremely rare occurrence for the notoriously reclusive rock icon. According to multiple accounts from those present, Dylan possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of Van Zandt's catalog and even proposed a co-writing arrangement. A professional olive branch Van Zandt reportedly met with characteristic apathy, displaying zero interest in leveraging the connection for his own advancement. This peer validation extended to the next generation of songwriters. A young Steve Earle, who would later become a massive commercial and critical success in his own right, essentially ran away from home to become Van Zandt's understudy. Earle served as a de facto road manager, carrying guitars and witnessing the brutal reality of Van Zandt's daily existence. Earle famously summarized the hierarchy of the songwriting community with a stark, confrontational quote to the press. He stated unequivocally that Townes Van Zandt was the best songwriter in the world, and he was willing to stand on Bob Dylan's coffee table in his cowboy boots to declare it. This was not hyperbole. It was a factual representation of how the internal hierarchy of musicians viewed the man who was currently failing to sell records. For over a decade, this immense critical respect generated absolutely no financial stability. Van Zandt survived on erratic, meager income from small club performances and loans from friends. He possessed no savings, no health insurance, and owned virtually no property. The financial architecture of his life was a ruin. The mechanism that finally delivered capital into this void did not originate from his own commercial efforts, but from the very industry he had spent his life antagonizing. The structural reality of the music business dictates that publishing rights, the legal ownership of the underlying composition, generate revenue entirely independent of the songwriter's personal performance. Because Van Zandt's songs were structurally flawless, they were inevitable targets for artists seeking high-quality material. The first major breach of the commercial wall occurred in 1981. Emmylou Harris and Don Williams recorded a duet of Van Zandt's ballad, If I Needed You. The track utilized standard, polished Nashville production and immediately climbed to number 3 on the Billboard country charts. Suddenly, the complex, melancholic lyrics Van Zandt had written years prior were being broadcast on the exact same radio stations that had categorically refused to play his original recordings. This success was merely a precursor to the defining financial event of his career. In late 1982, Willie Nelson and Merle Haggard were recording a collaborative album. The sessions were chaotic, driven by heavy drug use and erratic schedules. According to studio accounts, Nelson's daughter brought him a cassette tape featuring Van Zandt's Poncho and Lefty. Nelson recognized the undeniable power of the narrative. In the middle of the night, Nelson woke Haggard, who was sleeping on his tour bus, and brought him into the studio to record the vocal track. Haggard reportedly recorded his verse in a single take, barely awake without fully understanding the complex narrative of the song, and immediately went back to sleep. Released in the spring of 1983, the Nelson and Haggard version of Poncho and Lefty was a commercial juggernaut. It hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot Country Singles chart in July. It received massive international airplay and generated an accompanying highly produced music video that entered heavy rotation on mainstream television networks. The financial impact on Van Zandt was immediate and substantial. The complex mechanical royalty system of the music industry dictates that every time the song was played on the radio, every time the album was sold, and every time the video aired, a fraction of a cent was legally owed to the credited songwriter. Given the massive volume of sales and airplay, these fractions rapidly aggregated into checks for tens of thousands of dollars. The supreme irony of his career materialized. The corporate Nashville machine, the exact entity he had built his entire adult life around rejecting, was now legally obligated to deposit massive sums of money into his bank account. He had not compromised. He had not changed a single lyric. He had forced the biggest stars in the establishment to adapt to his reality, and the establishment was paying him for the privilege. However, an influx of capital cannot restructure a dismantled psychology. For a functional professional, this massive windfall would represent security, the purchase of a home, investments, or the funding of a stable recording environment. For Van Zandt, the money was merely an accelerant. He did not use the royalties to normalize his life. He continued to live in unstable rented housing. He used a portion of the funds to purchase a boat, which he aptly christened the Poncho and Lefty, but he lacked the discipline to maintain it. He gave away large sums of cash to friends, strangers, and fellow musicians with reckless, immediate generosity, treating the money as an abstract, temporary concept rather than a tool for survival. Most critically, the massive royalty checks removed the final financial barriers, restricting his substance abuse. Poverty had served as an involuntary governor on his addiction. There is a biological limit to how much heroin and alcohol a man can consume when he has to panhandle or play a 3-hour bar set to afford it. The Pancho and Lefty money eliminated that limit. The financial victory over the music industry did not save Townes Van Zandt. It simply financed the acceleration of his final fatal descent. To accurately document the final 15 years of his life, one must abandon any romanticized notions of the tortured artist. What occurred was a brutal clinical process of chemical and biological annihilation. The financial victory over the Nashville establishment meant nothing to a man who had already surrendered total control of his central nervous system to heavy narcotics and alcohol. He transitioned from a marginalized genius fighting for artistic survival into a high-functioning addict systematically tearing down the remaining load-bearing walls of his existence. His substance abuse was not recreational. It was a full-time occupation requiring immense logistical effort and physical endurance. The baseline of his daily consumption was staggering. He did not simply drink to take the edge off. He consumed massive toxic quantities of alcohol, specifically favoring a lethal daily combination of cheap vodka, heavily cut with rum. He drank this mixture continuously from the moment he woke up until he lost consciousness, maintaining a baseline blood alcohol level that would have hospitalized a normal human being. This constant influx of high-proof liquor subjected his liver, pancreas, and cardiovascular system to relentless, decades-long trauma. However, alcohol was merely the foundation. Van Zandt compounded the physiological damage by developing a severe, intractable addiction to heroin and cocaine. The introduction of intravenous narcotics fundamentally shifted his operational reality. The daily pursuit of heroin became the organizing principle of his life, superseding his songwriting, his touring schedule, and his basic survival instincts. Maintaining a heroin habit while living a transient, unpredictable life on the road meant constantly engaging with the criminal underworld, placing himself in physically dangerous environments, far removed from the safety of the recording studio. The desperation induced by this level of chemical dependency led to decisions that demonstrate a total chilling disregard for his own legacy. There is a deeply embedded, widely circulated account regarding the absolute bottom of his addiction. Some sources claim that during a period of severe heroin withdrawal, Van Zandt became so desperate for a fix that he legally signed away the entire publishing rights to his first 4 albums. The alleged price for surrendering the foundational masterpieces of his career, songs that would later generate millions of dollars, was a mere $20. Whether this specific transaction occurred exactly as legendary whispers suggest, or if it represents a composite of numerous terrible deals he made while intoxicated, the core truth remains undisputed. His addiction was so profound that he viewed his own irreplaceable art as nothing more than temporary currency to stave off biological sickness. This cognitive degradation bled directly onto the stage. The live performances of Townes Van Zandt in the late 1980s and 1990s often ceased to be concerts and evolved into grim, uncomfortable medical exhibitions. Audiences paid to see the legendary outlaw, the master poet of Texas, but they frequently found themselves watching a man actively shutting down in front of a microphone. The physical toll was impossible to hide. He appeared gaunt, severely underweight, and prematurely aged, his posture stooped and his motor skills compromised. When he stepped on stage, the alcohol and narcotics frequently sabotaged the very asset that made him famous, his mind. He would sit on a stool severely intoxicated and begin to slur his speech. More devastatingly, he would routinely forget the lyrics to his own compositions. These were not simple pop songs. They were intricate, dense, multi-verse narratives that required absolute mental clarity to execute. He would start a complex song like "Fare Thee Well, Miss Carousel," lose the thread of the narrative halfway through, mumble incoherently, and abruptly stop playing. Sometimes he would fall asleep mid-performance. For the audience, it was a harrowing experience, watching a brilliant architect incapable of navigating the blueprints he had drawn himself. This erratic behavior decimated his professional reputation among booking agents and venue owners. The deliberate professional sabotage of his earlier years had now mutated into sheer uncontrollable negligence. Promoters who still revered his catalog would book him out of respect, only to watch their investments evaporate when he either vanished entirely or was physically incapable of finishing a set. He was no longer a rebellious outlaw defying the industry. He had simply become a tragic liability that independent clubs could no longer afford to underwrite. The collateral damage of this lifestyle extended far beyond his career. It completely incinerated his personal life. Living with Townes Van Zandt was an exercise in enduring perpetual chaos. He was married 3 times, to Fran Petters, Cindy Morgan, and Janine Munsell, and every single marriage collapsed under the crushing weight of his choices. He was incapable of providing emotional, financial, or physical security. The domestic environment he created was frequently unsafe and highly unstable. His behavior was governed by unpredictable mood swings, deep depressive episodes, and the constant, erratic energy of substance pursuit. A highly specific, recurring pattern of behavior highlighted his inability to function within a normal family structure. Multiple accounts confirm that Van Zandt, perhaps driven by a distorted sense of empathy or lingering guilt over his wealthy Fort Worth origins, would frequently encounter homeless individuals on the street and simply bring them back to his house. He would invite vagrants, addicts, and rangers to live in his family's home, expecting his wives to feed, house, and manage them. This was not an act of organized charity. It was the impulsive, chaotic action of a man completely detached from reality and the basic requirements of domestic safety. He forced his spouses to bear the burden of his extreme, unmanageable choices, prioritizing the immediate needs of strangers off the street over the stability of his own children and partners. When his wives inevitably demanded boundaries, or when the sheer exhaustion of managing a stage 4 alcoholic became too much, the marriage is shattered. It is crucial to state the facts of his decline objectively. Townes Van Zandt was not a passive victim of a cruel music industry, nor was he simply a tragic casualty of his early psychiatric treatments. While the insulin shock therapy undeniably damaged his memory, and the Nashville machine attempted to exploit him, the absolute destruction of his physical body and personal life in his later years was the direct result of his own agency. No record executive forced him to drink a quart of liquor every morning. No promoter put a needle in his arm. He made a daily conscious series of decisions to prioritize chemical oblivion over his health, his family, and his ability to perform. He rejected every opportunity for rehabilitation, actively fought against those who tried to intervene, and constructed an impenetrable fortress of addiction around himself. He demanded absolute freedom from society, from the music business, and from domestic responsibility. And he used that hard-won freedom to meticulously execute a 30-year plan of self-destruction. The bill for that freedom was coming due, and his body was rapidly running out of the currency required to pay it. By the time Townes Van Zandt entered the 1990s, his continued survival was no longer a testament to his resilience. It was a dark, confounding medical anomaly. The human body is not engineered to process decades of continuous, high-volume alcohol and intravenous narcotic abuse without catastrophic organ failure. Yet Van Zandt was still walking, still traveling, and still occasionally recording. He was a man operating entirely on borrowed time, his physical infrastructure hollowed out by his own relentless consumption. His physical appearance during this period provided undeniable forensic evidence of his internal decay. The striking, clear-eyed young man from the Texas oil elite was gone. In his place was a severely emaciated figure with deeply lined, graying skin and a skeletal posture. His voice, which had once possessed a clean, resonant baritone that carried his intricate melodies with effortless precision, had been reduced to a damaged, gravelly rasp. The vocal cords themselves had been scarred by thousands of cigarettes and endless quarts of raw liquor. This physical deterioration profoundly altered the delivery of his art. When he sang his older material, the performances no longer sounded like a young man warning of a dark future. They sounded like a dying man providing a first-hand report from the abyss. Despite his advanced state of physical collapse, there was still a market for his presence, particularly in Europe. While the mainstream American music industry had largely discarded him as an unmanageable liability, European audiences and promoters, particularly in the United Kingdom, Ireland, and the Netherlands, viewed him with immense reverence. They treated him not as a failed country singer, but as a legendary American poet, a living artifact of authentic folk tradition. Consequently, he continued to embark on grueling international tours. The logistics of these European tours in the 1990s were a nightmare of crisis management. Van Zandt was no longer capable of traveling independently. He required the constant presence of road managers, often his manager and friend Harold Eggers, whose primary function was not to tune guitars or negotiate contracts, but to keep Van Zandt alive and upright. These handlers were tasked with an impossible contradictory mission. They had to ensure he consumed enough alcohol to prevent severe physical withdrawal and seizures, but intercept him before he consumed so much that he became comatose or completely unmanageable on stage. The tours became a grim routine of navigating airports, train stations, and hotels with a man who was frequently incapable of walking unaided. Eyewitness accounts from these European circuits describe handlers literally carrying Van Zandt to the microphone stand, placing his guitar over his shoulder, and hoping muscle memory would take over. Astonishingly, it often did. He would sit on a stool, severely compromised, and manage to execute complex finger-picking patterns, driven by an ingrained, almost autonomic connection to his instrument. But the margin for error was non-existent, and the performances were always overshadowed by the very real possibility of a collapse right there on the stage. In 1994, this damaged, fragile version of Townes Van Zandt entered a recording studio in County Galway, Ireland, to record what would become his final studio album of original material, No Deeper Blue. The recording process, supervised by producer Philip Donnelly, was an exercise in capturing a vanishing ghost. The environment had to be carefully managed to accommodate Van Zandt's limited physical stamina. The resulting album is a stark, difficult, and profoundly honest document. The polished, sweeping production of his early Nashville days is entirely absent. Instead, the record is sparse, heavily relying on his weathered, cracking voice. The lyrics are stripped of any remaining youthful romance. They are blunt, fatalistic assessments of a life that has run its course. It is an album recorded by a man who knew precisely how close he was to the end. As 1996 drew to a close, the accumulated damage reached a critical mass. The human liver, when subjected to end-stage cirrhosis, loses its ability to filter toxins and produce the proteins necessary for blood clotting. The cardiovascular system, battered by years of cocaine use and severe alcoholism, develops dangerous, irregular rhythms. The central nervous system becomes completely dependent on the presence of a central nervous system depressant, alcohol, just to maintain baseline electrical stability. Van Zandt's body was a collapsing structure held together only by the constant, continuous administration of the very chemicals destroying it. In late December 1996, the inevitable catastrophic failure occurred. While at his home near Nashville, Tennessee, Van Zandt suffered a severe fall down a flight of concrete stairs. Given his extreme state of malnourishment and the likely presence of alcohol-induced osteoporosis, his skeletal structure was incredibly fragile. The impact resulted in a severely fractured hip. For a healthy individual, a fractured hip requires immediate surgical intervention and months of physical therapy. For a 52-year-old man in the final terminal stages of multi-substance addiction, a fractured hip is effectively a death sentence. The accident forced him into the formalized medical system, an environment entirely incompatible with his necessary daily regimen of alcohol consumption. He was transported to a local hospital where orthopedic surgeons evaluated the injury. The medical reality they faced was a terrifying paradox. To repair the shattered hip, they needed to place him under general anesthesia and perform invasive surgery. However, preoperative blood panels and physical examinations revealed the true, devastating extent of his internal condition. His heart was weak and his liver was failing, making the administration of surgical anesthetics an incredibly high-risk proposition. There was a significant chance his heart would simply stop on the operating table. More critically, the hospital admission immediately initiated the most dangerous physiological crisis an alcoholic can face: forced, abrupt withdrawal. When a stage 4 alcoholic stops drinking, the brain, which has been severely depressed by alcohol for years, violently overcompensates. The central nervous system becomes hyperexcitable. This condition, known medically as delirium tremens, or the DTs, is not merely a severe hangover. It is a fatal cascading neurological emergency characterized by massive spikes in blood pressure, extreme tachycardia, terrifying hallucinations, and violent grand mal seizures. The medical staff at the hospital found themselves trapped in an unwinnable scenario. They could not safely operate to fix the hip because of his ruined organs, but keeping him in a hospital bed without alcohol guaranteed the onset of delirium tremens, which his weakened cardiovascular system was almost certainly too fragile to survive. They were staring at a patient whose decades of deliberate, extreme lifestyle choices had finally cornered him. Every available medical option carried a massive immediate risk of death. The system that Townes Van Zandt had spent his entire life defying, mocking, and escaping had finally caught up to him, locking him in a hospital bed, forcing him to face the brutal, unavoidable biological consequences of his absolute artistic freedom. Faced with this clinical paralysis, his ex-wife and executor of his estate, Janine Van Zandt, executed a drastic and highly controversial intervention. Against explicit medical advice, she signed him out of the facility. She loaded the severely emaciated, wheelchair-bound songwriter into a vehicle and drove him back to his home in Smyrna, Tennessee. This was not a discharge to a rehabilitation center or a hospice facility. It was a retreat to an unregulated domestic environment where the only available palliative care was the very substance that had destroyed him. The final days of Townes Van Zandt's life were stripped of any remaining artistic romanticism. Confined to a wheelchair with a shattered pelvis and femur, he was entirely immobile and completely dependent. The immediate, terrifying threat was withdrawal. Eyewitness accounts and subsequent interviews detail a harrowing reality. To stave off the fatal onset of delirium tremens, Janine was forced to physically pour liquor down his throat. This was not recreational drinking. It was a desperate, crude form of chemical maintenance aimed at preventing his central nervous system from catastrophic failure. However, the human body cannot sustain a paradox indefinitely. The alcohol required to stabilize his brain was simultaneously poisoning a liver that had already failed. Toxicity levels in his blood compounded exponentially. His cardiovascular system, strained by the trauma of the fall, the agony of untreated bone fractures, and decades of prior cocaine and heroin abuse, was working violently against the mounting chemical imbalance. On the evening of December 31st, 1996, the physiological strain reached its absolute limit. Early the next morning, Janine checked on him and found him completely unresponsive. Paramedics were dispatched to the Smyrna residence, but all resuscitative efforts were futile. Townes Van Zandt was officially pronounced dead on the morning of January 1st, 1997. The official coroner's report listed the cause of death as cardiac arrhythmia. From a forensic standpoint, this means the electrical impulses coordinating his heartbeats simply devolved into chaos and stopped. The underlying mechanism, however, was total systemic exhaustion. The heart did not fail in a vacuum. It failed because it was the last functioning engine in a body that had been systematically dismantled over 30 years. There is a striking, inescapable historical fact surrounding his death that most mainstream obituaries barely registered. Townes Van Zandt died on the exact same day, January 1st, as his lifelong idol, Hank Williams, who had perished in the back of a Cadillac 44 years prior, under remarkably similar circumstances of extreme substance abuse and physical neglect. Van Zandt had spent his entire adult life studying Williams, covering his songs, and mirroring his self-destructive velocity. His death on that specific date served as a final grim punctuation mark on his absolute commitment to the outlaw archetype. In the decades since his death, historians and medical professionals have debated the true origin of this fatal trajectory. Some sources claim that the brutal insulin shock therapy he endured in the 1960s inflicted permanent neurological damage, fundamentally altering his brain chemistry and rendering him medically incapable of escaping severe addiction. They argue the medical trauma stripped him of his executive function, making his lifelong substance abuse a prolonged biological reaction rather than a choice. Conversely, other biographers and close peers assert that Van Zandt possessed total, unyielding agency. They argue he calculated the exact cost of his lifestyle and willingly paid it, using the drugs and alcohol not as an escape, but as a deliberate tool to maintain the absolute isolation required for his writing. The truth likely exists in the collision of both realities, a traumatized mind that actively weaponized its own trauma against the world. The aftermath of his death triggered a swift and ironic industry reaction. Almost immediately, the commercial Nashville machine that Van Zandt had spent his life antagonizing began to heavily monetize his catalog. Posthumous releases, tribute albums featuring mainstream country stars, and heavily polished reissues flooded the market. Major record labels easily absorbed his legacy, packaging his uncompromising, difficult life into a safe, marketable narrative of the tragic genius. His estate generated more reliable revenue in the 5 years following his death than he had seen in his entire working life. Townes Van Zandt won the war for artistic control, but the victory was strictly posthumous. He refused to let the industry edit his words, dictate his schedule, or sanitize his reality. He demanded the right to document the darkest, most broken aspects of the human condition without interference. He achieved that pure, unfiltered transmission of truth, leaving behind a flawless catalog of American songwriting. But the collateral damage was total. He utilized his own body as the primary fuel source to keep his artistic fires burning. And when the fuel ran out, the machine stopped. He was not a victim. He was a man who demanded absolute freedom, obtained it, and allowed it to kill him.